All right, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Today we are looking at APIs that we will expose to make the parsing of the release.json file that we publish for our releases a bit more friendly. Jack, do you want to give us an overview of what this feature is for?
So there's been an ask from a few customers that we've talked to about how they manage deployments of .NET Core in enterprise and how they get information about what's available in terms of updates. Some of them rely on looking at tweets, some rely on the blog posts, others have written simple applications that query the releases JSON to essentially look and see when updates become available. We have internally used the API recently to work on an enterprise tool for MSIT CSEO to figure out what's available, what's the latest release, look at what's installed and things like that. So that's mainly what we're using it for. And we decided the API might be useful for other people that want to write other tools to query the releases JSON. Not necessarily to manage installs, but just to find out what's the latest release. Is there a security update perhaps that's available in some of the releases? Like, is there a new SDK that's been deprecated? Has support been added in, or an SDK or runtime been added to a specific version of Visual Studio and things like that? And the data also drives, I think, the .NET website. Kathleen can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think like if you go to like the download page, we see everything. That's driven by the release JSON data as well.
The website is driven by the data, and we have at least two other potential uses for this right now, both in helping people understand the global.json on their machine, which we have a community member working on, and also we have some internal ideas about acquisition improvements we make in the future, where this would be very important to that, to be able to basically query your machine and be able to give you information about whether you're up to date. So these are some of the ways that we want this to be used. We basically, the source of truth is the releases.json file, and we believe that this is information that is important to people, and we want to show that in a way that is a nice, pretty API, instead of people having to go download the file and parse it on their own, which we think would be a very bad way to go about this. So this is just a library to perform that space between, here's the file, here's the source of truth, and here's the data you're interested in.
And is this library, is this library part of the SDK, or is it an external NuGet library that you just install when you want to use it?
I think we are currently expecting it to be a NuGet package, but I don't think we have totally closed on that at this point. At this point today, we have no use of it in the SDK. A year from now, I may or may not give you the same answer to that. It depends on how we go in a couple of different directions. And I think until it was needed by the SDK, we would not put it in the SDK.
Yeah, the only reason I'm asking is because it kind of controls like how fast this API has to be, perfect. If you ship it as a NuGet package and you start as a preview, then we have a bit more time to, fumble with the APIs.
Yes, that is the path. If we wind up putting it into .NET, it would be like a year from now. So we do have a bit of time for feedback on it.
Makes sense. And you already kind of said this, but I'm still asking explicitly.
Yeah.
The one question I have is, so in terms of consumers, so is the idea that we don't have any bits right now in the box that depend on it? Or is the idea that it's a public API we can use? Reason I'm asking here is because I was wondering what dependencies your library has. I mean, you seem to depend on clearly a JSON parser. I assume it's system text.json would be my guess.
At the moment, it's Newtonsoft.
Okay.
Because of the CSEO tool. I mean, the library's development was driven mostly by the CSEO tool, and that required to be a 452 application. So system text.json wasn't an option.
Gotcha.
The reason the tool was full framework was because of our dependencies on other assemblies we had that did not support core. Though I can totally see us changing the tool to be a self-contained core app, and then potentially targeting something like 472, and we can move to system text.json instead.
Yeah. So just one thing. So system text.json is available for NetStandard 2.0, so you should be able to use it everywhere you can currently, including .NET Framework. But like, yeah, the reason I'm asking is because depending on who is using the tool, so for example, Visual Studio has issues with several people using Newtonsoft JSON and then get everybody to agree on what version of Newtonsoft JSON they're using. So if you are planning on using this let somewhere in Visual Studio, for example, then that's one thing to consider as what dependencies you're pulling in. But other than that, I mean, Newtonsoft JSON is just fine, right? I'm not trying to get you to move to system text.json for because it's my feature, but like it's just one thing to consider.
Yeah, no, I mean I'm very much aware of the issue with like the Newtonsoft JSON Visual Studio. Just one other point, you asked about the SDK. We did implement some features in 5.0 where if you're targeting end of life runtimes, the SDK will actually issue a warning for you now in 5. At the moment, that information is static based on what's currently considered end of life. The idea was at some point that we would be able to query the releases JSON in the future to get the real data of what's actually, between, 5.0 and 6.0, something else, 2.1 is likely going to go, out of support. Then we have to go make a change to the SDK, like being able to use the library to query what's actively there.
I see.
Is something that we're thinking of long term, but we haven't figured out how we want to do that because it's potentially an online trip that it has to make to pull the data, which means it adds over into like the bulk process and things like that. So, but that's just another application for it potentially.
Yeah, we have 2 places that we're still tied to information about that ultimately is in releases.json, but that we hard code into the SDK. We do that in 2 places, and that's an important part of our forward-looking acquisition strategy to snip those last 2 things, so that we can only update the SDK when there's an SDK change instead of continuing to update the SDK based on runtime security improvements. So I guess that's a driver to say keep an eye on that, keep an eye on the dependencies, which is where your question was driven from.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a question that we can come back to, that Jack and I and Mark can come back to.
Right. So then, and this is
Does .NET Standard go to 4.5.2? .NET Standard 2.0? I didn't think it went that far back.
No, it doesn't go to 4.5.2. It goes to 4.
Okay, so
6.1 minimum, but realistically 4.7.2.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, 4.7.1.
Yeah, that's why I couldn't target standard 2 for JSON, because enterprises would need to install 4.7.2, whereas 4.5 is guaranteed to be included, at least, and supported. So that was the current limitation, but we have plans to work around that in the future.
That is fair. So, unless there are more questions, then I would just walk the APIs top to bottom. That's usually the easiest way. I would use the API view tool because we already have comments in there, and I'm bad with remembering stuff.
Emo, do you believe you are currently sharing your screen or not?
I do not believe that I share my screen.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that I didn't forget to share my screen, but that's a different problem. Let me try to find the window again, which is the biggest problem. I think it is this one. Ah, damn it, Teams. Stop minimizing the windows. All right. Can you guys see my screen now?
Yep.
Perfect. Yeah, so we have comments in there so that we can, because some people, like myself, annotated the APIs beforehand, which is generally good. So I didn't annotate the namespace, but like I was just trying to ask the question, like, do we think that's the right namespace in general? Because I don't know what we have in the Microsoft deployment today. I don't think there is much, if anything, in there. It doesn't strike me necessarily as bad, but it's, we generally prefer using existing namespaces over creating net new namespaces. So I was wondering, like, we already have namespaces for the entire SDK tooling, right? I don't know which one it is again, but like, I think it was Microsoft.NET or something. Does anybody remember?
Yeah, I mean, the deployment repo is something that's taking on more work. around things like acquisition and stuff. And since this is concerned with the releases, that seemed to be like the sort of a logical place, I think.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing wrong with the namespace. It's just that, usually, when we have existing namespaces, we try to fit into those rather than creating net new ones, right? So I was just wondering, like, if the rest of I don't know whether we have any public APIs except for what's it called, the project model or whatever the thing is that was the DOM for the, what is it, the assets file or something, right? So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, maybe that is the right namespace. If we don't have a lot of prior art in the space, it's probably fine.
We can check with Dan Lifon about how he's anticipating that area growing, and if it overall is a coherent set, and maybe get back to you on that, because I think part of that is some forward-looking work, if I understand some of that.
I briefly talked with Nicola yesterday, and it sounded like he mentioned that the repo is growing large enough that they're considering out like having to introduce special tags for all the projects and stuff to manage. So from that, I gather that there must be some amount of growth, but how much, I'm not certain.
Yeah, this does seem more like a .NET releases thing than a like how releases in general would work. So it should have .NET in the name somewhere.
That's a good point. Like, it sounds like the framework for building deployments, right? Which it is not.
Yeah, it's not.
It's a very specific set of releases, which are ours. I mean, there's a downside of putting .NET in there. Like, imagine we would have put .NET Core in there. We would regret this now because we rebranded the product, right? And that's the general problem with like brand names. I'm not very gung-ho about .NET either. It's just that we have used it in other places, for better or worse. Mostly for worse, probably. But like, it's just a consistency argument, right?
The other thing that concerned me was if you look at like the DTF framework, that is the managed wrappers for the native OS APIs that deal with like Windows installer and stuff. That is also, I think, under the Microsoft deployment namespace, I seem to recall.
But that one seems finer, right? Because that's just generic wrappers around Windows deployment APIs, right?
Right, but I mean, I'm just saying like that being very specific tied to like Windows and some of the wrappers, and this also being like in Microsoft deployment. I can definitely see the argument to like bring in something that's .NET related in the namespace.
I see. So that was my other question of like, is this stuff Windows only, or is this working on Windows and Linux? And
at the moment, it's because it's full framework. It's Windows only. But I mean, the content in the releases JSON is eventually, if you go down to the leaf nodes, it's all the installable files, which is like the tar files, ARM, everything would be there. The files eventually that you can get. So somebody could potentially write a tool and say, well, we can create releases and download files for Mac or for Linux, because all that information is there.
I see, but like you're not calling any Windows APIs from this API, correct? So you just it's just really just an object model over the JSON file. It doesn't do anything else.
Yeah, it doesn't do anything else.
So it could be perfectly cross-platform as well.
Yeah. It definitely we're definitely expecting it to be cross-platform. The work in the SDK would not work. I mean, it just wouldn't function unless it was cross-platform. So we definitely expect the future of this library to be cross-platform.
Makes sense. All right, then I guess let's go into the meat. So the core type. So that's one thing that I was slightly confused by. If I just look at the outline here, like you have a release and you have an I-release, and I think Michael also pointed this out. It is a bit weird that you have a release type that doesn't implement I-release. So I mean, my general question is like, do you need I-release? Because the thing is, I mean, you probably don't have the same exact breaking bar change that we will have, but the problem with interfaces is you can't really add members to it safely over time because somebody might have implemented that interface and then their code breaks. So that's why we generally prefer abstract base types over interfaces if possible. And it seems like this is mostly a collection of things that releases in general share, right? So like it seems like it's, unlike IEnumerable or iComparable, where, once you have the concept, it really doesn't change over time. Versus this one, I can totally see you adding a new property to this thing over time, right? Like, I don't know, an end of life date or something, right?
Yeah, things do change underneath us, and the the naming has been very difficult because of how things are named in the actual releases JSON. So the release type itself, that encapsulates a full release, which constitutes potentially multiple SDKs, multiple runtimes for both core runtime, ASP.NET, and the Windows desktop runtime. Whereas those are sort of almost sub-releases or sub-products, if you want. So the idea of iRelease was that if I want to go through all the files, let's say, in a specific release, and I want to capture the runtimes and the SDKs, those are the ones that have files and potentially versions and stuff associated with them. So ASP.NET Core runtime release, SDK release, and the Windows desktop release are the ones that implement the iRelease interface.
I guess that would be useful. Do you have like a quick summary of like what the relationships between the big items are? So you have, so a release, I suppose, is something like .NET 5 or .NET 6 or .NET Core 3.1, right? And then there's, I guess, runtimes and SDKs, right?
Yeah. So at the root, you have the releases index JSON file, which I believe the releases class is the one that has the factory methods for downloading and instantiating those. And then within the index, you essentially have what's really a summary of the channel, like say Netcore 5.0 or 2.1, and it gives you a short breakdown of like, this is when it's expected to go end of life. This is the latest runtime, the latest SDK that was pushed, contained the security update or didn't. And then that summary has an additional URL that points to the full JSON for that specific channel that covers everything that was publicly released in, say, 2.1 or 5.0 or 3.0. And then once you parse that, you essentially get, for each time that we do an actual release, you get a release which then can have multiple SDKs and runtimes associated with it, depending on what we decided to ship.
Okay, so releases is, of course, the entire thing, right? And then I guess channel is, how should I think of?
Is a specific major minor version. So 5.0, 3.1, 2.1. You can think of the channels. That's the thing that would potentially go out of support. It's like, is that a specific version of 2.1?
Yeah, that's interesting, because I think your definition of channel is somewhat different from what I intuitively think of channel. Like when I hear channel, I think like, preview versus nightly versus stable, right? Not like, 2.1 versus 3.1. So like it seems like because I mean intuitively I would think like if you ask releases for get latest, it would say probably at this point 5.0 preview or something, right? But like it seems like if you want to get the latest for 3.1, you just have to get the channel for 3.1 and then ask that for latest, right?
Yes, you ask the channel for the latest to get the specific version. Because if you query the releases overall for the latest, you'll potentially get multiples, because we can ship multiple releases at the same time across different.
Interesting. So like
channels. Yeah, and then the channel version just sort of stuck based on like how things were named in the releases JSON and how we think of it when we actually ship updates and stuff publicly.
So what is it? So channel, I guess, is release channel, right? That's what you call get latest.
Yeah, I had to come up with something that's not as generic as like just channel for the class in essence. But
let me just hide the comments really quick so we can just see the APIs for now. So release channel is this guy here. And then that's the one where you ask for get latest, and then you go back a release. And when releases is the thing that you called, so that's where the entry point was, right? Create from default URL.
Maybe pull up CDIM. So let me just put this in the IM if you want to pull this up.
I'll admit that I know this stuff and I've gotten a little bit lost on the definition of these things. here. So we have, I'm wondering if we could get a one-sentence definition of what in this context a release is, a channel is, and then there's a kind of a level that I have in my head that's not here, which is not a problem. It's just that I'm not yet relating to these. And I'm going to guess probably I'm not the only one, since I came in with maybe too much knowledge. But
so a release is a full net core release that includes runtimes and SDKs. Whether it's servicing or security, doesn't really matter, but it's a full product release of everything. Like, it's a coherent build, essentially. You can think of it in that context. That release is associated with a specific channel, which has a major minor version, and a channel describes essentially all the releases from day one to where we are today.
So is it then fair to say, like a release channel in your world is really a row in those tables that we ask customers to select the .NET Core that they want to use, and then every one of those rows has a button that basically corresponds to get latest, and then behind that button is logically, every time we effectively push one of those guys, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know how much are you attached to the naming convention that is in the JSON file versus what you want in your APIs, because my personal viewpoint is there's always some value in aligning them, but very often the serialization format is impossible to change. So whatever naming you have is the naming you currently have, and that's not going to change. So like my question is, can we rename things here in the API service, or would you, flip a table when we do that?
I think we can rename stuff to make it more clear.
And then the other question I have about the channel is, you said major minor. So is that major minor feature of the SDK, or how does that align with between the fact that we release quarterly and yearly?
Everything that I've seen seems to be just the major minor in terms of, like, for the most part, usually on the runtimes, or how we brand the release. Like when we talk about like .NET 5.0 or 3.1, there is an SDK associated with what we might consider to be the latest release, but there's also runtime. And we've been unfortunately inconsistent with individual releases, how we pivot, because sometimes we use the SDK version for a release. 90% of the time, I would say we actually base the release overall on the version of the runtime that goes out. But there's been exceptions.
All right. Yeah. Okay.
That has caused issues as well, especially for get latest, because you can't actually look at the version. Because the few of the releases that have an SDK version, the SDK version, because its third part is always in the hundreds, is always bigger than any runtime version that's there.
Yeah. Yeah. So, in my head, there's words like feature version and stuff like that are not great words, but I would like not to use the word channel. Well, I saw in one of the comments that Christoph was concerned about the vagueness of the word release. I think we can potentially nail down an exact meaning for release, because it is an action in a set of things. But I would like there to be as few words as possible that you start with having, a naive person starts with having almost no relationship with the words. So I'm thinking naive, what would my words be? And feature set means something different to us, but the thing I want is ultimately, this is a super important concept for somebody using this, because ultimately that's the thing you want. And so what words, anybody who has any ideas for these words would be greatly appreciated, because what I want is obviously not the right name for this field.
I'm thinking
okay,
band.
I'm going to have to take this call, sorry.
Would something like a product release be more, because that's really what a release encapsulates. It's potentially multiple products or multiple parts.
So I think part of the problem here is you use release pretty much everywhere, right? So like it becomes very overloaded. I think I would say, like, if you use release as a word you combine others with, I think it's fine. So for example, release file, release index seems largely fine. But if you do something like product like release channel, for example, I think is because of the word channel is a bit ambiguous. I would probably choose something else. Like I don't know, maybe band is better. Release group might be.
Band is a different meaning for the SDK though.
Yeah, they have the
But
feature
maybe like
bands
something
there.
like
That's fair.
a product channel. Product channel would be more suitable for that potentially.
Yeah,
Or
that
a
would.
products channel because it's essentially describing a bunch of
Maybe,
releases.
but a channel to me means daily
Yeah.
RC preview, like it's it's sort of which place are you looking to get releases?
Yeah. That's why I feel like bands or group or something to that extent makes more sense, because you would want to convey this as a different version of the product, right? Not a different like source where you got the bits from, or different quality level, I guess is the way to say it. Right? Channel implies quality levels, versus I guess a band would just acquire would imply like a feature set.
So is a channel here essentially just a product line, or is it like an addition of a product?
All we're talking product line, I think, is a great name for that. Right, because it is just major minor, right? That's really what it is, right?
Yeah, correct.
I mean, product line I like. What do other people think?
So we would have one channel for .NET Core 3, one for .NET 5, and so on.
Yeah, the link that I posted is the actual index, and this is like where the channels are sort of summarized for like each of the major minor ones.
Right, and Corey, I think it's one for 3.0 and one for 3.1.
Yeah, correct.
Not one for 3.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, from our perspective, it's if the TFM changed, it's a different one of these things.
Yeah, but I think we're not quite ready to call this TFM. That links two parts of our world together too tightly.
Right, it's as far as the runtime's concerned, one of these things is equal to a distinct TFM. A distinct parent TFM.
It is what the customers are going to think about.
So if I'm a customer, I'm going to be using this for, I don't want any feature updates or any compatibility breaks. I just want to know all the releases for 3.1 so I can have the latest version.
I would say yes and no. There are cases where you would care about it, but when you start looking at the SDKs, you likely want to care about the feature bands, because the feature bands in the SDKs at least implies some amount of compatibility, right? So something like 21600, there's just things associated like support and visuals and certain versions of Visual Studio, while 218 is maybe not supported, or 21700. So for the SDKs, at least, feature bands have some amount of compatibility, but it's usually around Visual Studio.
Right. I mean, let's table the feature bands for a moment, because that's another level of complexity. I mean, let's just start with the big thing at the very top. So basically, your entry point is releases right now, right? So the one thing I would say is plural names are not great if you also have the singular name, because then it's just very subtle in the API, release versus releases. So I would suggest
you might think of it as a collection or something.
Right. Like, well, that wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, because realistically your entry point is exactly that. But I just think if you only have this little s at the end as the differentiator, that's just very subtle. So I would recommend renaming your entry point to something else. I don't know exactly what you would rename it into. But the other thing I don't understand, because it's a bit weird. I mean, if it just would be a static type, it also wouldn't be too bad, but you actually return instances, right? So you basically say create from default URL, then you return releases, which is a bit odd. I guess in your world, if you actually call it release collection, that wouldn't be terrible. But then if you enumerate that, you better have individual things called release, right? Because the release collection really should be, a list of releases. But which in your world I don't think would be the case, right? So like your releases doesn't really have that. It has a collection of channels realistically, right?
Yeah, because releases sort of started at the index, and at one point I had it named releases index.
Right.
Then I thought, like, what do I call? Do I then stick with the release index, which I still have for like the individual, like a single, like this? It's sort of like almost like a product line summary, if we want to stick with that notion. That's essentially what it is, because it just gives you a summary of.
Yeah, I
everything
mean,
that's
I think honestly, release index wouldn't be bad. I mean, release set might not be bad, or if we say we would rename release channel to product line. Maybe product line collection wouldn't be terrible. It's a bit weird to have entry points into a collection that are static. That's not amazing. But maybe that's close enough.
I mean, it's not what I would traditionally think of as a product line, though. It's almost just like a branch of a single product.
Yeah, I mean yeah. I mean, the question is, what name do we want to give this, right?
Kathleen, I see your hands up. We're generally just a shout out meeting.
Oh yeah, sorry, I don't even check because I'm taking notes. I don't even see it when you raise your hand. You're muted right now in case you're talking to us.
All right, maybe it was just still up from earlier.
Maybe. So, I mean, like, I guess one thing we could just say, the major minor version, we just designate that's the product. Right? And then we just say .NET Core 1.0 and 1.1 are just different products, right? And then we could just say, okay, realistically what this releases file gives you access to is the products, right? So you then can say this is the product set, or the product information, or something to that extent, right? And then I think it would be sensible to say you start with product information, what did you say? Product information dot create from default URL, and then you get basically back a thing where you can ask for the individual products, right? Does that make sense to people, or?
Yeah, I think product is a good name.
Yeah, I mean,
so one release
reevaluate when we get to product version, but
one release can have multiple channels here. How does that play out? What does that look like in the file?
Well, I mean, the releases right now is the entire file, right? So you would have one channel right now per major minor version, right?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So release.
So think of it.
Think of releases as not a single release.
Yes.
Yeah, releases is universe.
Yes. Yeah. It's essentially the releases index, that URL that I pasted in the IM. That's where it starts, and then it will parse each of the index entries, grab the JSON for that, and then deserialize that whole set of releases for that channel, and then you can basically query it from the universe releases.
I see. Now I understand. So releases.json is basically just a file that points to the JSON file per product version, effectively.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. But that's kind of an implementation detail of how the stuff works, right? It's just the mental model that we want to have. So then my next question is, so if you have basically a list of channels on the releases, it seems a bit odd that you have channels, channel count, and then channel versions. I guess channel count to me seems redundant, because it better be just channels.count, which you can't do because you give me an IEnumerable. But like, I would think for those kind of things you want to give me probably a list at least, anyways. And then the next question is, like, maybe you want even a custom collection if you want custom indexers, for example, right? Because then you don't have to do things like, have the indexer on the releases take the channel version. It might make more sense to just say, channels bracket channel version, right? That seems more natural than exploding these things out.
I see what you're getting at. Yeah.
because right now basically because you use IEnumable, you're basically forced to have all the stuff effectively one level up, right? Versus you would really want this under channels.
Yeah.
And on properties, effectively, you should never return an interface, especially for enumerable things. So this should be read-only collection or list or a custom collection type. And it's because whatever it's returning, someone's going to cast it. You're never allowed to change it. So just be honest with what it is at the beginning. That's the short summary of how we get there.
Yeah, like I mean, like what do you store it under right now? It's presumably these are all arrays, right?
Sorry, say that again.
So the actual data that is backing channels, channel versions, index, and support phases, I suppose they're just raw arrays. You just expose them
They're
as
just JSON arrays. Yeah, really.
Yeah. So that's why, yeah, probably you should store them as something that is like a an array. That's fine, but then keep in mind that if you expose it, like if you literally just return underscore channels, which is a field of type array, somebody can just cast your IEnumable away into an array, right? So one thing we do often if you look at our collection types work, we have these object model namespace where you have things like collection of T and read-only collection of T. And so what you do is you construct one of them and you pass in the underlying data. And so then the consumer of this collection thing, they can't cast it away, right? Because the actual data is effectively an internal field of this type, right? And so you have more control over your data. People can't just cast it away and then store data in the array, which you may think is crazy, but the reality is people do serialization all the time, and then they end up accidentally depending on the actual runtime type that you exposed it under, right? Not the actual thing you typed it under. And so that's one thing to keep in mind. So long story short, I would probably have a custom type, like, I don't know, probably not channel collection, but like product collection that is, deriving from type, let's say, read-only collection of product, right? And then you have your own custom indexer that takes a channel version and then gives you back a product, I guess, right? And then the other things kind of are no longer needed. What is a release index?
So that is like a single entry that describes a specific channel. Like it's sort of like a summary of what's a channel today.
So is there any reason why this data isn't on the channel itself? Is it just because that's how it's in the JSON file?
It repeats in the channel, but it gives you a quick overview if you're working through all the through the index itself. Some of the data.
Oh, sorry. So the index is. Oh, I see. So basically, the releases file. Sorry, the releases type represents what's directly in the releases.json, and then the
releases index JSON, because that gives you all the indexes.
I see. So then is it fair to say that release index is just a smaller version of release channel?
Yeah, it is a single summary. So it has no information about individual products. It just has a summary of like what the current state of the channel. It's almost like a channel state in some ways, or I guess a channel summary or a product line summary, because it literally just says like, this is the version of the channel, this is the latest release, it's end of life.
I see.
Last update was a security update or not. And you can get some of that information is in the actual channel itself.
Yeah, so what I would recommend then is as we said, like if you rename channel to product, right? What I would do is I would put the data that is currently on release index, I would put it on the product type itself, and then I would say the product type itself, data that you would have to do more work to get it, just put it under some nested property or nested method under product, and then people just go from releases to product. Product is all the summaries, and then if they want to get more data, well, then there's more data on the product type itself, rather than having this split between release channel and release index. Because now it's like, well, it's kind of a similar concept, but one has more data than the other. Like it seems a bit weird to split it like you would do in the JSON file. Like in the object model, you would just have it on the same type, and then some data might be lazily loaded and some data might not be, right? And so it seems a bit weird to ask your consumers to look in different places, because then you have to, like if you're standing on a channel, how do I get the corresponding index, right? Like that's a lot of work versus if I'm standing on the product, well then, it's property A, B, and C, and then C might require more data to load, but A and B does not, right?
Yeah, is your create from default URL or create from anything really, are those greedy? Like, are they finding all of the references to releases.json and grabbing them all and building the full model, or do things get walked lazily?
I think create from default is more aggressive. The other ones will use a local copy unless you tell it to go online and check for a new one, which is the I think the third one, the one with the use latest. Which if you don't want to go online to see if there's new releases, which.
Right. Well, like I'm looking at the content of the releases index JSON, and it looks like it just links to other releases.json files.
Yeah.
And so
it is not lazy at this point.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, one point that we skipped over is all of these things need async versions. If you touch the network or a file, you should also have an async version.
Yes.
And if it's aggressive at the entry point, then you only need async entry points, and everything else is just data, which is happy. But we're currently missing that. Okay, so when you create one of these things, it will open n+1 files where n is the number of, I think product is the name that we came up with thus far.
Yeah.
Okay.
If that's the case, it doesn't seem like there's, I mean, like Emu was saying, having the index and channels being separate concepts, they really should be consolidated.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, do we want this to very closely resemble the file format, or would we like it to be a more like idiomatic object structure that happens to serialize to a certain format?
I mean, my personal opinion is if you want it to be a successful API, I would not mirror it of the underlying JSON file, because it's usually cumbersome, right? And it's usually not, like, I mean, you can do some interesting tricks in the file where you split things across different file boundaries to avoid hitting things. But like in the object model, you model these things usually differently, right? You would, as I said, like instead of having like, channel and index, you would have some properties of channel, or even a method on channel that allows you to fetch the other data. And that might be way more useful and easier to use than, a secondary top level entry where you now have to map them back and forth, right? And then once you do things like this, usually my experience is if you try to align the naming, it usually doesn't work anymore, because the concept you call the release and the file format might be split across 4 files, versus in the object model it might be just one, and then it might be more confusing than anything else if you try to artificially try to make them the same. So I would just say treat this API as an abstraction over the file format, and then if somebody wants to go party on the file format themselves, more power to them, but then they have to read the file format and deal with what naming that one has, right? And I would just keep the API here as just really convenient and simple to use.
Yeah, I mean, looking at the files, it looks like this is a pretty simple hierarchy here. We have channels, and each channel has one or more releases.
Right.
So I'm not sure how much kind of duplicating data or summarizing it is going to get here, unless our goal is maybe reducing I/O for a user who may not need the detailed information.
I mean, that's my other question I have is like, I didn't really listen to the answer to what Jeremy said, but like, basically when you go to the entry point, create from file, even if this thing is super eagerly and it loads everything, I mean, we talk still about like, a couple 100K JSON, right? So like that would be, on modern computers in the orders of milliseconds, right? So if you load everything in memory and then you just treat this object model as a representation of what you loaded, like, does lazy loading these individual files buy you that much? That seems mostly complication at that point.
Yeah, I mean, for the amount of data, it probably doesn't, because the files are usually very, very small.
I mean, that kind of depends on your scenario, right? Like if I run this tool once a day to fetch updates, it pretty much can be as slow as I want, right? But but if I do this in a hot loop somewhere, then it might matter, right? But this doesn't strike me as something that you would ever run in a hot loop anywhere, right? Like it seems very infrequent.
That would be very odd to do, I would imagine.
But over time, is that concerning? Because if you're, I'm questioning if it really should be lazy loading, because over time, the releases index is going to contain all the end of life products, and loading all their releases.json is probably a complete waste.
I mean, I hear what you're saying, but let's go. It's 10 years in the future, right? So we ship now once a year, right? So let's say it's 10 years. And then effectively you have, I don't know, like let's say 10, 20 releases a year or something. Like how big is this JSON file, right? That's still going to be less than a megabyte probably, right?
It's not so much the loading of the JSON file, it's loading the releases JSON file, which would be a network hit, right?
Oh, because you have to fetch multiple files rather than one large file.
Right.
Gotcha.
You fetch one file per channel.
Yes.
Here.
So you'll get the file for 1.0 and for 2.2 and 6 and 7.
So I agree with Emu, but it's really the loading of the subsequent releases JSON and that network hit that's the concern.
I mean, one thing you could do is,
I guess, the parsing overhead as well, because that file is the one that will potentially grow very, very large.
Would it make sense to split this into two APIs? One that is like fetch the index and the other that is fetch the release. That way a user could choose to ignore older releases if they want.
Assuming that they know what the release is that they want, I would say yes. The other thing that the index sort of gives is it's the one source of truth to say, like, these are the official release channels or product lines, what we want to call them.
So
like if you ask for like the 3.2, it's obviously not going to be there because nothing is defined for 3.2. But if you want to find out what's all the three releases, the releases index is the one that tells you there's a 3.0 and a 3.1 channel, and that's all the three versions there are to potentially query.
So let me try to understand what's happening now. If I say releases create from, you basically just parse the root JSON file, right? Nothing else. Is that fair?
I believe I parse both at this point, just because I've been using both.
But conceptually, you could just parse the root JSON file, right? And that presumably has metadata of what channels exist, right?
Correct.
And so then the idea would be if I just do the create from, you just parse the root JSON file. And then I guess in your world, if I just query the index property, you wouldn't have to fetch anything else. But if I were to query the channels thing, now you have to fetch all the channels in order for give me the actual channel data. Is that fair?
Yes.
So then I kind of agree with Cord, and it would make sense to me to say we have some sort of type that represents the metadata in that JSON file, which in your world right now is the index, I think, release index. And I would still call this probably product or something. And then, the actual heavyweight data that allows you to, that you need to, in order to fetch more data, you call really product details, let's say. And then you have an async method on product that fetches that if you want. This way, basically, when I just say create from, I just get the fast metadata. I can iterate over them. I can find the one that I'm interested in, and then I can say on that guy, okay, now go fetch the details. And then basically you can scale this indefinitely and only hit the files you need.
Yes. Yeah. It only lazy loads like the index, and then the moment that you actually start hitting any of the channels, it just goes and gets them all.
So would something like the two APIs I posted in the chat work here. Just kind of separate fetching the index from the channel releases.
Well, but the words you used here of, so the enumerate channels async, again, let's go with the words that are here instead of words that we figured out later. All of that comes from the same source, right? So you're just parsing the one file. It's probably never going to be all that big, really. So I don't know that I would do async enumerable. I would probably just make it be, you know, task of channel collection.
Sure. But I think that the general idea is that we're letting the user initiate each individual IO here.
Right.
Yeah. So and then on channel collection, you get a channel, and then on channel you would get, you know,
Channel details.
Instance method of, you know, get details or get releases or whatever it is that channels hold. And that would have get releases and get releases async, and which would indicate this is a fetch operation. Which is actually getting closer to modeling what's in the file instead of more abstracted over what's in the file, but it does separate the network requests to things that you actually care about.
Yeah.
So it's, hey, I want to find the URL for the 3.1 releases. Thank you for giving me the official URL for the 3.1 releases. Hey, 3.1 releases, what's going on?
Yeah. I mean, that's
I guess the summary also would tell you I'm already on, I said 3.1, 3.1.8. So I'm good. I don't need to go ask any more information.
Yeah, the other thing I would do is I would use async. I think you don't use async APIs anywhere. I would make it very clear where the boundaries are where you fetch data from the network by basically using, you know, task of whatever you return, right? So for example, create from should return a task of whatever the thing is that it returns. Because basically that also makes it clear for the user what are the expensive operations, right? Right now, when I would just dot into the channels thing, well, then you magically do an IO request behind my back, and that might block now, right? So it seems from an API standpoint, like on the one hand side, like I think I like what Jeremy just said. It's like the general problem is you want to know when you actually hit the wire, right? And right now it's hard because you just dot into the channels thing and then, you know, some IO happens. I like the abstraction in the sense that you don't give me these, you know, grab back of individual items like channels and index. So I think like just making the naming a bit more consistent and like, you know, moving these async methods to the actual objects from which you fetch them is nicer for the user, but you still understand where the expensive part of the enumeration come, right? You're not surprised that if I do a for each loop and then for each, you know, item I fetch more data, you know, the code looks as expensive as it is, right? It doesn't look cheap. That's kind of the point.
Yeah, and especially like I'm jumping a little bit ahead, but on the release file, for example, like that's the guy that has like an individual URL, the actual
right
entity that you can download. Like that, I mean, I have a utility method there for download, but I would imagine like that you would really want something like download async because it's potentially going and fetching like a few hundred megs.
For sure.
To bring down.
And to be clear, the guidance is actually, so your networking and file operations, you should have async, but then you should have non-async versions of all the things that you have async because someone will want them.
Yeah, I guess in your case, that's an interesting point, right? So because you're servicing the .NET Framework customer base, and the problem that, I mean, it's not so much that .NET Framework customers are less sophisticated, it's just a function of existing code, right? The problem is async is viral. So the Azure SDK found this out the hard way. They did everything nicely async, but then you want to drop, you know, some Azure into your existing enterprise app, and then you realize at the actual place where you want to store some data in Azure or retrieve some data from Azure, you know, on an async code path. Well, then you have to convert everything to async. But the thing is, you still kind of make it clear for people that want to use async where the expensive parts are, right? But just having effectively overloads, one with async, one without async, it's kind of clear what operations are expensive.
Yeah, and they know that it's going to be like something that's IO bound potentially.
Yeah. So don't do properties that do IO, right?
Yes.
That's the big one. All right. So like I think we gave you a lot to think about. Like it's hard for me in my head now to mirror this, but like I guess you probably have to another iteration on this anyway. So I kind of wrote down the notes of what the rough thing is we said. So then, okay, formal release now. Where should we go? Index or channel?
Can I ask a question about the releases? Jock, can you explain what create from file with use latest, the use latest overload?
So the idea there was like, especially like in the context of the tool that I have today, is it writes a bunch of data like to the user stem folder. So it will bring down the releases JSON there. It will do typically like if you do like create from file, it will automatically look for the latest to see if there's a latest one. So it like does a head request, figures out if it's not a newer one, it doesn't download anything. It just takes the data that's on disk and it parses that and deserializes that JSON. Otherwise, if there is a later version available online, it will go and fetch those and bring those down. The use latest to disable it, that should probably be more internal because the JSON is large. I actually have collections of just the raw files, a specific version that I'm using for like some of the unit tests and stuff. So that mirrors real data because there's been some issues in the actual data that's live that are inconsistent. So I found for the unit tests, if I can just use like a static set and never go and like accidentally like bring down a bunch of new data, because then my unit test will have to change underneath me as things go out the door. So that can probably just be like an internal.
So does the releases in just the create from file with just the releases index path? So that's kind of like a local cache path.
A local cache, yeah. So it puts the file, the index in whatever folder you want, and then it sort of assumes that like if you want to get like the 2.1 or the 1.1 channel, whatever, there's going to be a subfolder because all the files are called just releases.json. So it creates a subfolder 1.1 underneath where the index is, and then it puts like the 1.1 releases JSON there, and there's a 2.0 folder and puts that, and it just reads all of those up. And if any of those are missing, it goes online.
So create from file will succeed even if there's no file there, because it's going to go. That's just a cache location, not a file to read from.
Yeah, it will look there. If the file isn't there or it's not the latest, it goes and fetches.
Oh yeah, that's totally not obvious. Yeah. Create from file sounds like completely offline to me.
Yeah, it's not completely offline.
So
that needs to be clarified.
Yeah. Okay.
So then what should we go next? What's the next logical level?
Oh, probably a specific release. Because that's sort of like where the...
Yeah, so like between release, index, and channel, like what should we look at? Should we look at channel first, or?
We can look at channel. I mean, that is definitely the next logical step where you're, you know, all the channels now you're looking at like 5.0.3.1 specifically.
Right. So this, yeah, basically now we have everything, and now this is the what we called the product earlier, right? So what is our model? Like, do we have an end of life date for the entire major minor version, or do we have it for? Yeah, I guess we do, right? Because that's how.
Yeah, it's like it's 3.1 as an end of life date. Yeah. And there can be a lag.
When I see date time, might want to make it date time offset.
It looks like these are actually just dates with no times. So
Yeah,
they're
just
always going to
dates.
have the midnight time. And I do think that we somewhere say use date time if you are representing a date with no time.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the things I dislike with the .NET framework, that we never added a pure data type. But yeah, if it's just no time, then the offset
That
is
makes sense.
making everything just more miserable. So the channel version, I guess that's just 3.1, right, or 2.0, right?
Yeah. I didn't really see the need to have a
Yeah, I mean,
a version type on that necessarily.
so the only reason why you may want a version type is if people were ever likely wanting to compare them. Because if people use string comparisons, that all works great until we ship .NET 11,
10.
right? Why even 10, yeah. And then bad things will happen. If you think they only ever use that to just print something on the screen or allow people to select stuff where you only ever need identity, then string is fine.
I have not seen that, but I can see that if you grab like the index and you want to like, I mean, I have like a one of the things that I wrote with the tool for CSO was like a query interface for the releases JSON, which had simple command line options, and it basically, if you queried like the index, it just dumped everything in order. But I can definitely see somebody like taking that information and trying to like, order by the channel version.
So where do I get
like
the display string, right? Like .NET Core, so .NET space Core space 3.1 versus .NET space 5. Where would that string get constructed from? Because if the only thing you actually do is effectively just search a particular thing, maybe it shouldn't be version but name. And then you just return literally what I just said, .NET Core 3.1, .NET 5, and then you can just look for those. But if you actually need to say, well, I'm on version X, what is the next big thing I can upgrade to, then you kind of want comparison. At that point, you probably want a version.
That is why there's a product version type as well.
Ah.
Yes,
okay.
That product version is actually a Semver implementation. Well, we talked about this previously, right? It's actually a Semver, but there's two additional things, because one .NET uses the Semver format, but it doesn't follow the spirit of Semver. And there is also the concept of, for the SDKs at least, feature bands and patch levels, which is a sub-interpretation of like the patch number and things like that. So that's why I called it, we need Semver, but it's we want to distance ourselves from the idea that it's Semver.
So, but your product version is effectively like the full 4-digit plus pre-release modifier, because it's basically like modeling an individual push on our end, right? It would be .NET 5, preview 7, some build number, right?
Yeah, it would be like 500-RC.1.build number, yeah.
So that's unfortunate, because if we rename release channel to product, then product version is actually the version of the release, not the product. So,
yep.
So I would probably rename just product version to release version, because it's always a version of a release, not a version of the product.
Yeah, and someone may want to tell Lee that we renamed .NET 5. It's not called .NET Core anymore, even though the file still says .NET Core.
Well, yeah,
it used to say .NET, and
I'm listening.
It changed back. I think Lee, I sent you a mail about that. It used to say .NET, and then it reverted to .NET Core at one point.
Yeah.
Lee. So
I have one more release to get that right.
Don't
We
worry.
haven't published 2 yet, and then there's GA.
Yeah, so like to me, it seems like your channel version is really more of a name of that product, except without the naming. But like, it may be worthwhile to just have, maybe you just have version as a string, and then you just have name that is the actual display name, or you just have display name. Yeah, display name might probably makes more sense.
Yeah, we probably have to concatenate it, because there isn't a.
Yep.
Well, I'm pretty sure you would just define it in code, but the point is you don't want everybody else to do the magic of saying, well, if it's less or equal to 3.1, it's .NET Core. If it's 5 or greater, then it's .NET, right? You want this in one place. So that also avoids that, Lee has more opportunity to get it wrong. So presumably when I'm getting a release channel, you already parsed the entire JSON file, right? So all the data that you currently have here, it's already in memory, right?
Yeah, that's on memory.
Well, this is the data from the releases index.
This is the information from the releases JSON. So
The release channel?
yes.
Yeah, the release index is what's from the releases index today.
Yeah. So release channel is potentially like it would parse the link that I just sent, so it'd be like for a specific channel.
So this file doesn't even seem to understand, or doesn't seem to have a name at all. Like looking at metadata 5.0 releases.json, the word .NET does not appear in here.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I think display name you would probably have to define in source code, right? You would say if the version number is 3.1 or late or earlier, the name is .NET Core. Otherwise, it's
Fair
.NET.
enough.
Well, technically, you could get that from the product information in the releases index.
Well, or like that, yeah.
Yeah.
Right, but depending on, like, if you allowed these to be built from a URL directly, then you'd have to, I guess, take it as a parameter of like, and what did you think this product was called? So yeah, because you're depending on data that is not self-contained in what it's trying to represent.
I mean, is that something we can change in the releases.json? Kind of a question for Lee.
Yeah, adding new metadata should be fine, right?
Right.
So you want to add in essence, the product name into the releases JSON as well?
Yeah.
So not just at the top index. Okay, that makes sense.
How do we maintain these things? Is this literally just Lee editing them?
No, the data for a given release is derived from the entire product as it's staged, and so there's obviously some version information that comes out of the build, and we just finished, in the process of finishing, at least on the 5.0 side of the world, tooling that will derive all of the version goo from the actual build drop. On the servicing, so 3.1.2.1, it's manually checked in config files that are then used to generate everything.
Yep. That makes sense.
I had a minor comment about the support phase. If that's a static list of known types, if that could be an enum, seems like that would help the usability.
I originally had an enum for it, but then the list changed when we shipped RC. Originally, when I looked at the data, we had basically end-of-life maintenance, which was an inconsistency that still exists, I think, in the 2.2 channel, which is essentially end-of-life. Then we had LTS and we had preview, and then when 5.0 RC slipped, RC suddenly appeared in the index, and it threw me, and I switched to like a freeform string.
Yeah, one thing.
I lost the battle of calling everything that's not GA a preview, and so sorry about that.
Okay.
I mean, the question is how often will
Lee,
these
can
things happen, right? It still seems like it's a very finite list, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, Lee, can we come up with a finite list that doesn't have to just be preview, but can be whatever we decide with management? But if we do lock the, if we wind up locking down a list, it's going to be pretty baked into the API. So we may want to do it with constants or something else that is somewhat more extensible than enums.
Yeah, I think the list we have now with the addition of RC feels like something that we could sell to, Hunter and company without a whole lot of difficulty.
All right.
I mean, to be clear, like, it's still fine if you have to add an entry every 3 years, right? Like, what really sucks is if the list is super open-ended. But if it's a very rare event, and then just every once in a while, like, somebody decided that, we no longer call it RC because it's, for whatever inconvenient, now we call it experimental drop or something, right? Then fine, then we add an entry to that. If we really wanted to be open-ended, you could do what we have done in the BCL with our stringly typed enums, where we basically have, a struct wrapper across strings. This way you can always have a representation for any given string, but then you also have predefined ones, and so it looks and feels like an enum, but it's basically able to hold any string. But I wouldn't do that unless you really need to, because it still seems like you have like 6 or 7 members, and that list is fairly static.
Well,
Well,
an
it's
enum.
like-
Go ahead, Kathleen.
I was going to say, as I think about it, I actually think that it's super important that we communicate in this API a finite set of intent that I believe is bounded. And then if we wind up, and that might be everything that's being preview. I don't know where RC fits in that.
Right.
And then we may wind up with a separate value for what's actually in releases.json, which may be a broader set. But if we add a new value, however we do it, if we add a new value and somebody's logic is dependent on the preview things being X, Y, and Z, and all of a sudden they're X, Y, Z, and Z prime, then their logic will be broken just because we added a new value. So I think we want to think a little bit on this one, because it is something that there could be logic on.
I mean, no matter what, adding a new thing will break someone, and so if you do an enum, it needs to have an unknown value of you couldn't parse it. But with an enum, you do need to be careful, and essentially you need to do it like, old basic, of don't give them adjacent numbers, because someone's going to, if you start out with it looking like, daily preview RC. STS and LTS, then someone's going to use greater than, and now you can't add another thing unless you skip by 1,000 between each one of them.
I was about to say, that's probably what I would do. I mean, you would just insert effectively gaps in between, and because it seems like that is generally valuable to have, right?
Right, and then so you'd have unknown at 0, and then let's say we skip by 100, and then always bisect whenever we're inserting a new thing, and then you'll end up with an unknown at some point when we defined experimental, but then you just service this package to say, oh, yep, that totally came in at value 50.
Or you just throw.
Or you throw, but then that means that the thing was working and you now can't read the latest file.
Right, but that, at least at that point, the fix is obvious. You have to upgrade your Yuga dependency to something higher, right? I mean,
fair enough.
And the problem,
you need to define that boundary.
Yeah, and I think that's probably what I would do, because quite frankly, like if you do string-based things, I think string-based is useful when you have an object model that has to round trip, right? So if you have to be able to load the JSON file and then write it back, at that point you want to be able to hold the value at full fidelity, in which case the string makes more sense. But in your case, you map it only one way, and so you can either decide you only expose 3 of the 20 items in the JSON file, you just have a mapping function, or you can decide you always map it 1-to-1, and then you have to have an enum member for every single thing that occurs, and then everything you don't know you just throw. That's also fine. Like, I think that's just make an actionable error message like, unknown data in JSON file, please upgrade your library, and that's the end of that, which still seems fine. I mean, I think this stuff does not run in production usually, right? You wouldn't expect a web server to, like, in a loop pull the JSON file and then randomly crash because we published a new release, right? That would be bad.
I think there's an alternate here. If we keep it as a string, and instead we can boil down what each of those strings mean in terms of features. So people aren't testing for instance, RC, but maybe there's a is supported flag where previews are not supported.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what the out of support flag is for, the property there.
Well,
but that's for the end of life date versus this is a preview build, like
correct.
The average
it was
person.
Never in support.
Yeah.
So one value that I can think of that's missing that actually means something with support phase is go live, which is probably what this RC thing should have been.
I was about to say that. So the problem with that kind of thinking is it makes sense at a high level. I just don't think you can take these labels and boil them down into policies that will actually be uniform over time, because our management will react to customer requests, and then in .NET 6 we may say that, for whatever reason, preview 7 starts to be go live, and then we named it preview because that's just the way things are, and then your code has a hard time reacting to this. I honestly think if you want to know what a particular label means, you probably have to read the release notes, would be my guess, because I don't think it will be that consistent over time.
Well, that's exactly what I'm saying. Instead of having this be an enum that people will make assumptions off of, maybe a string is better because it's specifically saying like, hey, this can be anything. You should
I see what
expect
you're
it to
saying.
be.
Well, the
And
problem with
instead, use feature flags like is something to describe what the support phase is.
right. Yeah, I think the only problem I have with that is that now you're going out of your way to not say what is the actual qualifier, right? But then you go to our blog and it says we push preview 7, and now you're trying to find preview somewhere in the list and you can't find it, and now you have to do the reverse mapping, right? So I think if the only thing you would do is programmatic access, I would agree with you. But given that people will have to map these values to something that they read somewhere, that seems a bit backwards. But I mean, that's the other question. Like, how do I get preview 6 versus preview 7? Are these different labels, or is it just
there would be releases within the channel, right? So if you go into like the 5.0, once you start reading through all the individual like releases, you'll find something that says this is the preview 7 of 5.0, this is preview 6, preview 3, preview 4.
But is the 7 kind of separate from the preview? Like, is it, this is a preview and this is iteration 7 of the preview, or is it just the label is preview 7 in that world?
It's just a version that's associated with the release that says that happens to contain the word preview in it, but it can also contain RC or whatever other metadata.
Yeah.
That's where the December comes.
Yeah, I was about to say that's the same as NuGet, where parsing is hard.
Yes, I mean essentially it's the sort of NuGetized version. It's release. If we look in 5.0's releases JSON, the last item in the array release version is 5.0.0-preview.1. And presumably that shows up somewhere under a release or whatever a release is.
Yeah, it's kind of a display version.
What is lifecycle policy URL? Is that a human readable thing or is it a machine readable thing?
It's an official policy doc.
Yeah, it's the policy website page.
So it is human readable, right? So the idea is you render this in a browser, you don't parse the result of that URL.
Yeah.
And that would basically tell you things like, yep, this is an RC, so this is go live. Or is this telling you you have 3 more years?
Yep.
It looks like it's just, .NET platform support policy, and it's a wall of text, and you get to figure out what you're looking for.
I see.
Not the wall of text related to your particular release.
Oh, so this URL is kind of static. It's not like actually per channel. Right. Just if you have the same URL for all of them.
Yeah, because once you go to the core support page, then you can see what LTS and whatnot means.
Yeah, like when you land on the thing, it's not even the .NET Core policy. It's the, if you want .NET Core, click the first link. If you want framework, click the second. So this is a thing for humans, definitely not a thing for machines.
So I have another question. So why do you expose latest runtime, latest SDK as versions? Why don't you expose them as the actual release? Because it seems to me like if I say channel.latest release, I should be able to dot into that and get all the data that a release actually has.
That's what the latest release does. The get latest release gets you that. That gets you information about if you I can.
Oh yeah, you definitely shouldn't have a get latest release and a property called latest release, and that they're different concepts.
Yeah.
That was literally just from like going through the fields.
Yeah,
it's coming up with the names, but yeah,
it's possible that the latest release date, latest runtime, and latest SDK don't matter. I mean, maybe latest release date does but all of this is just get latest release dot and then the data off of it.
Yeah, the versions do matter, like when you're able to actually figure out what's actually installed on a machine where you want to compare and say, like, is this what's
Oh,
latest version that's installed?
Well, I think we need to make sure that we have access to the latest feature band. That's a question we need to be able to answer, let people answer. For the SDK.
So if you take the latest SDK, which like should really say latest SDK version, I guess, from the version, you can actually extract the feature and the patch. Like the
Okay.
product version has properties for feature band and patch level.
Good.
I was
Okay.
about to say, like, I mean, it seems like, I mean, I'm not saying the version numbers don't matter, right? But it seems more logical to say latest release dot version than to say latest release version, and then the only thing you get now is the version number. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah,
like
the
it seems
question
to me
is-
you have to fetch. Like, I don't know how you compute latest release and latest runtime, but presumably it's a for each loop over releases, and you ask for the latest version number. So at that point, you might as well just keep the entire object around.
Yeah, I think the object model was mimicking too closely to what the releases JSON is, rather than a rich object model.
Yeah, I think this shows the history of this, which is basically that we had a need for it for this CSEO tool. And as soon as I heard about it, I said, yippee, and other people, Dan Leofan and some other people as well said, yippee, we need to make this public API. And I don't think we sat down and invested with Jacques, who was working on the CSEO tool, and really thinking this at great depth. And to be honest, I think we could use some help with that to get that right. So if anybody wants to volunteer to a meeting to go deeper into some of these things that is attuned to the way we do APIs here, that would be appreciated from my point of view. And we might bring Dan in as well, who's got an interest in this. I think it's worth getting this right, and I think we've the natural way for Jacques to solve the problems that he had was to come from the point of the JSON file, and I believe that between the lines under what we're seeing today is that maybe this API should reflect the questions people are going to ask and
Right.
how those questions are going to get answered, and that eventually within the API you're going to be able to get to all this information, but that maybe it's not just a wrapper for the index, but a way to ask questions of our source of truth. And so I think that is a bit, it's going to change a few things in the API.
Yeah, I mean, I've already run into some of those issues where just because of how the data is structured, where I look at a specific SDK and I'm digging deep into the SDK, and at one point I sort of want to say, well, I actually want to go back to the top level of the release that has this SDK, because I want to find something related into like the ASP.NET Core or the Windows Desktop runtime. And because of the way the data is parsed, I have no way to link back from, say, an SDK to the actual parent release that contained that SDK, because there could be,
Right.
or even like the runtimes, because the runtimes can appear in multiple releases.
Well, I think some good news here is that we're not under, if we can, you know, Jacques can use this as it is for the CSEO tool, which has the immediate need. And we have a little bit of breathing room, not boatloads, because there are some things that I would do with this nearly immediately if it was ready. But I think that taking a step back and looking at how the questions might get answered, and possibly even bringing in the community members interested in the global.json question, although I could talk him into being interested. So we'll see if he's actually truly interested or just was convinced to be interested. And so I think a deeper thinking of this from the perspective of how we use it, which is the way we should approach an API, is worth doing at this point.
Yeah, I mean, we literally have one use case at this point for it, essentially.
Yeah, and we do. I mean, we have the others. We have the others we're beginning to understand. So the global.json questions, we know the simple things that we want from that, and what we think we need for acquisition. We're going to very soon have an idea of what we think we'll want for that. We know what we need for the two cases of snipping the runtime and SDK. So these other things that are out there, I think we didn't 2 months ago, but I think now we're starting to get enough of an idea of that we can sit down and put some things on the table. And I guess with that, you all are going to have to give feedback as to what is most useful right now, except that, we kind of need to step back, which is the way I'm kind of feeling based on this conversation, And I don't know how much more detail it's worth going into right now. And I would really like it if there was somebody that doesn't necessarily have to be involved in the whole process, but before we come back to this size of a group, getting some feedback along the way on expressing this problem would be great.
Yeah, I mean, like what I would do is, like, I mean, we have 30 minutes left, so like I would do is I would go with the mainline types and the mainline relationships, and then once Jack has another drop of that where that feedback is addressed, we do another pass over it. I think part of it is also just I actually like I always wanted a command line tool where I can just find releases and jump to the download pages directly, right? So I'm happy to just play with the API a little bit as well and actually get a sense for that. But I think by and large, the biggest problem that you have with most APIs is just get the concepts right? Get the key terminology and the key relationships right, and then the rest is just more or less the long tail. But I think we're getting close. I mean, the API is not super large either, right? So I think if we take one more meeting, I'm pretty sure we get to something that is not perfect, but substantially better where we are today.
Good.
And that might be enough.
Head towards like a preview release or something like that.
Right.
But yeah, on the thing currently called release channel, the 4 properties that start with latest, assuming they all match a similarly named property off of the return value of get latest release, the object model doesn't need those accelerators. Like somebody can just call get latest release dot release date and get latest release dot runtime version and
Yeah. Would it make sense to have latest SDK and latest runtime as properties, and is there a need for get latest release?
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking.
So latest release, gets you the other runtimes that are not there, right? So it might tell you the actual version of the latest runtime, but what the release will get you is all the SDKs, because the release can potentially have multiple SDKs. And the release will give you back the specific .NET Core, ASP.NET Core, and Windows, Windows Desktop runtime.
So maybe I'm not clear on the terminology, but like latest release, is there any reason this couldn't return release? Because then you could say latest release dot version, and presumably it's the same thing as what it returns right now, right?
Yeah, the only difference there is you might sometimes be interested in the latest release that is not a security update, where you care about, like, and this again is very context specific, and the stuff that we've encountered with writing a tool that can manage the installs and saying my central IT department has a policy for the company that they're trying to implement and that they need to meet, and I might care about the latest release, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a security update. I want to differentiate between those two. So if we then have like a latest release and latest secure release then potentially to differentiate.
So, but like, let's say what you're saying makes sense to me, but then the question is, given your operating model right now, presumably latest release has some policy to fetch the latest product version. And then when I call get latest release, either with or without the security update, you have also some policy to find something. So if I now say get latest release, and I now ask for the product version of that release, if that's different from what latest release gives me, that is the same problem, more or less, right? You know what I'm saying? Like, I mean, it seems weird for me to say you expose these things as properties, but they return a subset of the object, and then you have another method that gives you the entire object, but they don't have the same policy on what latest is.
I see. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, like, so I think the position is take all the properties that start with latest, delete them. Now there's get latest release and get latest release with a Boolean. Either that stays as a method or that becomes latest release and latest security release. And because I don't think that you would ever, if you want to find the latest release that wasn't a security release, assuming that the most recent version was a security release, like, just walk the list. Like, I can't think of a scenario where you would want the latest release with no security fixes, unless that was the latest release.
I would even suggest just getting rid of the get latest release. I think someone could easily use a 2-line link statement over that releases collection.
I mean, I agree with that. I would just say, I mean, I think these methods have value if the policy is super easy to understand, and it's the most common policy people want, right? I mean, get latest release seems like something that, most people probably want, right? Like it's whatever is the latest one seems like a very reasonable question. And the more advanced it gets, I would say, at that point you just write your where clause, right? Because, well, you asked the question, right? I think though your 2-line method is not as simple as you think it is, because you have to, order it by something on the release. And then I'm not sure that that's that easy. If you can just say order by a product version, or whether there's more to it.
You can't order by product version. That's one of the catches.
Yeah.
So I would make I would turn that into the 2 properties that each return the kind of object that is currently called release.
Right.
Latest release and latest security release, and they could be reference the same object. Assume they would be whenever the latest release is a security release. If there's never been a security release, then latest release is the latest security release.
That's my other question. So like all the properties are non-nullable except for release date. Like what is this? What is the case where I have a null release date but a non-null latest release? That makes no sense to me.
That has evolved from the end of life date, obviously, because it's usually with new channel size, the end of life date gets decided later in the future.
Right, that makes sense.
I have encountered a few instances where release dates were missing. So
we just don't have the data in the JSON file, but like
there's been and related to that, that's one of the reasons why I brought in that bool property called is out of support, because there is often a lag between once the end of life date is announced and a channel will reaching end of life and the support phase changing from something like current or like LTS to end of life. So that Boolean property actually looks at both the end of life date and the support phase to make that decision, because there's sometimes a lag in the data.
Yeah, that one makes sense to me. Like, I mean, I would just say like things like you have a nullable date where you effectively have a logical error in your JSON file. I think that's something we should fix at the JSON file, or I don't know whether you can compute a release date in any sensible way, but like it seems a bit weird to like just forward this to your consumers, because I don't know how you would deal with that.
Right.
Yeah,
if that was the one from the header and we're getting rid of it, then it doesn't even matter.
Yeah, as part of the schema validation, when we're building the releases, that release date should never be empty anymore.
Yeah, and if we don't have one, just use Lee's birthday, right? That works.
Yeah, that can definitely fall away. I mean, that was probably a workaround that I put in at one place where the file wasn't updated yet, and I needed to give this to CSEO to run for deployment testing and stuff. So that's probably like something that got left behind there.
All right, so release channels have releases, so maybe the next thing to look at is a release.
I had a Uber question that I wanted to ask about these types. I see they're immutable from their public surface, but they have a public constructor. What's the value of constructing them if you can't do anything with it? What's the expected pattern there from an API perspective?
Yeah, the constructors I think needs to disappear, because there's, other than I think for Lee, there's no reason for people to ever produce these files by themselves, right? Like you would always consume. Everybody would consume, and there's literally like one producer in the world, I think, at this point.
This is an asset produced, during a release and updated during a release. I don't think it would make sense to come from anyplace else.
Yeah, I mean, like it seems given that everything you have is read-only, I think that makes sense to not have public constructors. If you really if you really wanted that file to be, if you really wanted that object model to also be supportive of Lee scenarios, I think this thing would need a major overhaul anyway, and that would probably complicate the object model way more than it helps. So I would probably just scope this to read-only.
Yeah, I would put on release channel another static method so that you can populate just one release channel from its URL, because right now you have to have built the bigger thing from the index. So being able to say like, whatever we end up calling release channel, hey, this is the file that describes you, go load yourself, and return the populated object, I would add at this point.
So something like, oh, I only want, give me the release for like the.
I mean, essentially, it would let you use the object model for the release, builds the 5.0 release metadata, and it says like, great, now go call release channel dot load from file, this file. If we can't parse it, fail the build. Like something went wrong. Where do not move this forward to the internet. And there's no reason for it to go load the big index file because that is unrelated to the process of producing a build from the 5.0 release branch. All right, so are we going to a release singular?
Yeah, let's go to release because I think I also want to kind of close the iRelease versus release discussion. So in your case, release is logically, is that actually abstract because you have other derived types, right? Like SDK release and Windows Desktop release.
Is SDK release a release?
No.
It's an iRelease.
A release is like the whole product.
Yeah.
SDK is information that's very specific to the SDK.
So a release has iReleases then?
The runtimes and the SDK releases all implement iRelease because of the
I see. So
files
the release
and versions, like that's the things that I care about. And sometimes when I look at a release, like if I want to download a full release, when I can, there's a helper called files, I can get all the files.
Yeah.
But there are some times where I want to iterate over all the releases, and I don't really care whether I'm dealing with an SDK or a runtime specifically, but I want to look at the versions and stuff like that are common to whether it's ASP.NET Core or a Windows Desktop release. They both have a version. I care about that, for example, and stuff.
It's a little weird that runtimes is the iRelease, but SDKs is the SDK release when runtime release was a concrete type.
Yeah, the runtimes, I couldn't come up with a clearer name for it because that essentially captures the ASP.NET Core runtime, the runtime, and the Windows Desktop runtime. So those are the three runtimes that ships. Sometimes I care about those three. I don't care specifically with which one I'm dealing with. I want to deal with all the runtimes that are part of the release. But there's also the concept of the runtime,
which
is
perhaps
actually
we would name
the .NET Core runtime, essentially.
As I don't know, CLR runtime
or net runtime or something like that.
Okay, so it seems like your notion of a release is kind of like a product release, and then you have the individual runtime releases and SDK releases on them, right?
All the parts of the release. Yeah, I wouldn't say that's my notion. That's the of the JSON.
I think my understanding here is this release is the verb of on the 8th of September 2020, we released 3.1.8. And then that has, there's the ASP.NET Core runtime component of this, which lives over there.
Funny, you have the exact term that I just came up with as well. Like, I honestly think we should rename iRelease to released component. And then you would have SDK component and Windows Desktop runtime component, and then you have a clear separation between the release, which is the entire thing, and then the individual parts.
Yeah.
And then it avoids this whole problem that release doesn't implement iRelease because iRelease now becomes released component or something.
Yeah, and then so iRelease, is release component, and then you could call it just the Windows Desktop component, the ASP.NET Core component, and then, for lack of a better term, runtime component, and then it would be release.components if you wanted to walk all of the ones you understand.
Yeah, the subparts. Yeah. Naming is like the biggest thing because there's a lot of overload, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I like release component because that's really describing what it is. It's
a part of the release.
So iRelease becomes abstract class release component.
Yep. And then it means we need, what did we say? We said, so SDK release would become release
SDK
component.
Yeah, SDK release component. Or SDK component if we felt like shortening names, but I don't think there's a lot of need to shorten the names.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, SDK component works for me. Like, SDK release component sounds awkward.
It's fine. Either way.
What
Yeah,
was the
SDK component is really sort of how I would think about it, but it feels like we're, as long as it doesn't seem like it's a release component and an SDK component are conflicting things instead of derived things.
I was just wondering if people might think like that gets you a part of the SDK, which is in turn part of the actual release. If there could ever be that sort of confusion.
Yeah.
So
if we said like SDK release component, we know that it's the SDK component of the release, not a component of the SDK within the release.
Yep, makes sense to me. So then we have runtime releases, runtime release component, and then what was the other one that we still have? I think that was the Windows desktop release, right?
Yeah, which just gets component slapped on the end.
Yep.
And did you get the ASP.NET one?
Oh, and the ASP.NET one, yeah.
Yeah, while runtime does appear in this file on ASP.NET Core, I would remove it. So ASP.NET Core release component.
Yeah, I would probably do the same thing.
As well.
Because Windows. Yeah, exactly. Because you call it Windows Desktop release, you don't call it Windows Desktop runtime release, right?
Yeah.
So let me do this, and then this would be.
Yeah, I used for the type names essentially to mimic the fields in the JSON, and then for the actual property names, I added runtime so that it was sort of clear that this is actually a runtime thing. That was the original.
Right. Well, I mean, the field name is ASP.NET Core -runtime. I just think that it didn't need the word runtime there.
Yeah, I think that's the problem, right? Like naming wasn't really reviewed properly, so it's not necessarily consistent.
There's no probably about it.
So my next question is: you have SDK and you have SDKs.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
In the release, there are some releases where there's a single SDK, and that is under the SDK entry. But there is also an array of SDKs where we ship multiple feature bands within a release. So say, for example, in 2122, we have a 600, an 800, and a 500 band. So the SDK would always point to if there's multiple SDKs, the SDK entry, and Lee can correct me, always points to the highest feature band within the release.
Correct.
Whereas SDKs gives you all the feature bands that are available.
So is it then effectively latest SDK?
They're all the latest SDK. They're the latest within the feature band. And the feature band relates to compatibility with things like Visual Studio and Visual Studio for Mac.
Is there a need for exposing the SDK? Like, maybe we just expose the collection, and then if the file doesn't have the collection, then you just promote the single entity to the collection of one.
Yeah, because otherwise you have to explain, like, if there is more than one, can I use the singular, and do I get a sane answer from that?
Yeah.
Yeah, because in the JSON, the SDKs thing was added when we reached a point where we had to produce these multiple feature bands, and so the only reason it's there is so we didn't break people that were already using the SDK. So hiding that particular implementation detail makes total sense to me.
Yeah,
we can hide it in the API.
The singular will always be the highest, won't it, Jacques?
If there's multiple ones.
If there's multiple ones. So if we just say that there's always multiple ones, I think that's much simpler. So that, I like that. And then people can just look for the highest that don't want to understand which feature band they're interested in. And then somewhere, I'll check with Lee about whether we trust the Visual Studio relationships that we describe in this file. I don't know if you've captured those or not.
They're coming back as raw strings at the moment because some of it is a lot of sort of like free-form, human readable. Some of the information a person has to actually read to make an interpretation from it. Like it's not possible really.
Right. So like for 3.1.8, the latest release SDKs, the 3.1.4.02 says VS version 16.7.3, and the 3.1.108 says 16.4.13. I don't know VS version, so I don't know if this is actually the minimum version of VS you need for it. But
so there's two. There's the Visual Studio version, which is the version where that band of the SDK was inserted specifically. And then there's also the Visual Studio support, which means that if you have that version of Visual Studio, you can install this SDK standalone, and it should work in that version. But the Visual Studio version is the version of Visual Studio where this SDK actually went into and shipped with that Visual Studio.
Okay, and somebody somewhere knows how to get the string Visual Studio 2019 open paren v16.4 close paren, if they care. Like if you're trying to find which one can I install on this computer, that's like from the registry or something.
That is an open-ended question.
Okay.
Yeah.
You ask Kathleen. That's the way you do it.
Yeah. I mean, my tool today can like query some of this stuff in Visual Studio, but mapping those two versions, the way that Visual Studio stores it and the way that we present it, because that data literally gets displayed as a string on a table on the .NET website for somebody, like as human readable text.
Yeah, that was its original use case, and the VS and VS Max support strings are structured that way because when I typed them, I thought it looked nice.
Fair enough. I guess at some point it can get a helper utility or like helper code could be added that does like a registry walk on Windows and is like, I think this is the SDK you want, but we can punt that.
That's a machine learning problem, probably.
Depending, we could potentially do some more work on that in the future, but right now, I don't know where people will use that other than it's heavily used on the website, and that's why the pretty display is important, because people go and look for the version they've got. The website's extremely confusing, but at least they can read the number when they get there, and so that's very helpful.
Right. Well, I mean, I could imagine, something like MSIT running a thing. It's like, oh, you have an out-of-date version. I'm going to go and upgrade your SDK for you. But then they need to know which one is going to actually work based on the VS components that you have installed. So they need to know which of the two SDK installs they need to use to upgrade you. And yeah, they could sort of figure it out from like installed product version says you have 3.1.107. So 3.1.108 is probably the right update instead of 3.1.4.02. But like,
yeah, it's actually super complicated. And Jack has just spent months on this particular problem. I think that should we go there, it would be an additional library because it would be it would be way more complicated than people think it will be, and very limited usage, we think, and it would be very Windows specific. So I would like to keep this isolated to just, interacting with this file, which does include a Visual Studio number, but not trying to go any deeper into that Visual Studio number. And then as we work with CSEO and external clients on the tool that drove this work, then we may find that there are people that want to write their own tools and get help with that. So we may split that off into an additional library. But I think it would be more like partnering with a very large organization that wanted help to do something like what we're going to release after it's checked out with CSEO.
Fair enough.
So my other question is, so I just talked about the SDKs, right? I guess the same thing applies to runtime because you have runtime and runtimes.
So runtimes, the idea was to have an enumeration of all the things that are considered the runtime components, that we're calling them. So the .NET runtime, the Windows Desktop runtime, ASP.NET Core runtime. So that makes up all. There's always only one runtime in a release. I don't think we've ever shipped.
Oh, I see.
Runtimes. But it enumerates all the runtime things that you need.
Right.
But
so
yeah.
Runtime will stay runtime. Runtimes becomes components.
Gotcha.
And I think if we have that listing of the individual components, it should be something like runtime components or something like that. While there is a level at which the runtime, ASP.NET runtime is a runtime, Windows runtime is a runtime, I don't think that's the way our users think of this. I think they think of the runtime as 5.0 big blob. And so I might get tucked out of that position, but I kind of think we ought to have some, since SDKs is a set of versions that all are the same thing, and the runtime concept is a set of different components, we should probably have a name closer to runtime components if we want to share that, which we might, because there's no Windows runtime prior to 3.0, and that might be helpful.
Would components then make sense to be all the runtimes and all the SDKs in the releases? And runtime components is just the 3 runtimes, and SDK components is just the 1 or more SDKs.
Yeah, right. So, and you know, it's just that to just say the plural, when there's 2 plurals that look parallel, if they're 2 different vectors, where one of them is component different things and the other is same thing different versions, I think that's confusing. That was what I was trying to break with that comment. And I'm not, that may not be, components may not be the best way to break it, but something that says, you know, these are actually the different subparts that make what you think of, because people download these as one thing. They download them by name, either the Windows runtime or the whatever we're calling the ASP.NET hosting pack now.
Is calling it frameworks, does that break the concept far enough away?
That might work. The only concern I would have on that is that TFM puts us with framework into that space, and I don't know if that would confuse people. I just want to, you know, think it through. I think all of this just deserves a little attention.
I also think like you want a term that works both for runtimes as well as frameworks, because the thing is, currently we have this iRelease thing which basically unifies them. So if you use the term framework, that works great for Windows Desktop and ASP.NET, it doesn't work for the runtime itself. Mm-hmm. And so, but then runtime is a term that only really works for the runtimes. I don't think of ASP.NET Core runtime and Windows Desktop runtime. I think that's an odd way to put it. So I think that's why I actually like the word component, because it is a thing, right? And there might be some way to acquire them, but like most people don't think of this as acquisition, right? They install the whole thing and then they restore and things are happening, right? They don't really mess with these individual packs, right?
Yeah, I mean, to make it simple and so that, you know, people can, or we can understand it, much less other people, I would do it as components, which contains the 3 different runtime components and all the SDK components. And if someone wants the non-SDK components, they can add the exclusion filter themselves when they're enumerating it.
Yeah.
But really, they're probably just going to grab the property of the kind they care about. And given that the runtimes property here isn't actually mirroring a single concept from the release, I also sort of slightly question if we want it. But if we do want it, just add everything. Don't differentiate SDKs from runnable components, because the world will get hard.
Yeah.
I don't know if I agree with that yet, but let's keep that on the table as an idea.
I mean, like,
we could always do less and add more later, because if we have runtime, SDKs, the ASP.NET, and the Windows desktop, like those are the levels that are presented in the file. And if we need I just want to walk everything, even though that doesn't necessarily make sense, then like
right.
Sure.
Yeah, I just don't think you ever are looking at runtimes and SDKs squished together. I don't think there's ever a case you do that. You're after one or the other.
Well, I would say like
you ever after Windows desktop and ASP.NET and runtime all together in a loop, or you want them by I'm looking at the ASP.NETness of ASP.NET.
You would be if you were looking at out-of-date components, or you were looking at doing acquisition updating on a machine. You would be in those cases. So there are some cases where you would be looking at all of those. I expect we would be as part of the acquisition. When we have a gesture that says, show me everything out of date on this machine, that's what we would be checking for.
I mean, keep in mind that like one of the first things people will do with this thing is print stuff to the console to understand the relationships, right? And I think if you just want to print a table to understand what's going on, you will print everything, because that's the only thing you can do realistically, right? And then you will form your mental picture of what it is you want to achieve, right? And then I think it's fine to say, yep, you only want to upgrade a runtime, but you don't want to upgrade the SDK or something. But I feel like the problem with trying to like do these splits by job is a bit hard to understand what the jobs are. Like I feel a bit more comfortable just saying, let's model the data that we have and then expose it in a terminology that is understandable, and then if there's more specialized functions we need to add, we probably want some methods or something like this that applies some reasonable policy.
Yeah, I hear you. I have to say, as I've listened today, I have a current growing opinion that may change in 10 minutes, that starting with the notion of releases may not be right. I'm not sure that that is what very many people coming to this will come, starting with the idea of releases. It's an important vector, it's an important thing to track, but we're kind of tree-like at the moment, and it may need to be a little more relational to simplify it.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. To me, the biggest get right in almost any API is your big terminology, right? And
because the trouble is, for the I want all of the components of this release that are not SDKs is, what do you call them, right? Runtimes is confusing because of the thing that we don't have a better name for of runtime, and we could call it non-SDK components, but now if we ever add some other kind of thing that wants to be excluded from it, we can't, because the name says it's non-SDK components. Maybe runnable components. But
I'm going to have to run to another meeting, I'm afraid. So I'm going to say goodbye, and I look forward to following up with Jack and whoever else afterwards. But I'm going to have to say goodbye.
That works. So I just pasted in the notes that I took. And I would say let's meet maybe 2 weeks from now. I don't know how much time Jack needs to actually take a pass on it, but I also would like to use next week's meeting to actually review the other things we now have on our backlog. So would 2 weeks work from now, or do you need something in the middle, Jack?
2 weeks is fine for me.
Then let's do 2 weeks from now.
Yeah, I have enough other stuff on my plate, so. But yeah, this was very helpful. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Then this is it. Thanks, everybody.
cool.
Bye.